Hyperthymesia. Hyperthymesia. I actually went on YouTube and found a video to help me pronounce that, and I still can't really pronounce it, but hyperthymesia. Hyperthymesia is the condition where an individual possesses like an extremely detailed autobiographical memory. So they basically remember everything. They remember a ridiculous number of events in their life, dwell in the past, that kind of thing. There's only about 30-some people who actually have been, I think, formally diagnosed with this particular disorder. And some of them, it came about when they were 12 days old, and they could remember everything going forward. And some of them, it was when they were 12 years old, but it's all kind of varying. And when I was talking about this with one of my employees, I was telling him about, this disorder, and he's like, that's awesome. He's like, I would love to be able to remember things. I'm getting older and I'm forgetting. Wouldn't that be great? I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't want to remember plus, I've made a lot of mistakes, let me just tell you. I'm not going to go into all those right here. But I kept thinking, like, no, that's like, to me, would be like the worst thing. I was thinking, I think one of the greatest gifts that God has given us, and especially those of us who are aging, is diminishing memory. He's also, the other thing I think is good that he's given us is that diminishing eyesight. And even though, I love those magnifying mirrors or whatever, they're like 100 times, but every time I use it, I think, I really got to have younger friends to tell me that I need more moisturizer and that I need to carry my tweezers around with me everywhere I go. But anyway, so that's just but it's true. But think about it. If you recalled every little detail of your life, how can you focus on anything? And I think it kind of ties into what a lot of people have been saying here, looking at the past and always looking back and not looking forward. And we all make mistakes, and we shouldn't have to punish ourselves every day for those mistakes. The first person who was actually diagnosed with it, her name was Jill Price. And here's how she kind of described having this disorder. She said it was a constant, irrepressible stream of memories, and it caused significant disruption in her life. Non-stop, uncontrollable, totally exhausting, and a burden. She was getting lost in remembering, and it made it difficult to even attend to the present or the future. And I think this is really important. When you think about it, our brains, and I think the researchers have shown this, that our brains actually block a lot of our painful memories. And thank goodness. Not everybody is like that. Obviously PTSD and things like that, it doesn't always happen, but it's a protection mode. And I think it's really important when we think about business or our professional lives. I think that probably the best memory would be the type where you remember the things that matter and you forget everything else. And it sounds so simple, but it's very hard to do. It's very hard. A lot of us dwell on the things that happened in the past. And there's another type of memory or cognitive function called compartmentalization. And compartmentalization is really big in aviation. My background is aviation, and we talk about compartmentalizing. And compartmentalizing is when you focus on the task at hand and forget everything else. Really important in aviation, because if you had something upsetting happen to you, doesn't matter what it is, you can't think about that. You need to think about flying. And so I was thinking about that compartmentalization, and I thought I would add like another descriptor to that. As an entrepreneur, I think it's important to have permanent compartmentalization in your life. Just forget what happened. You want to make sure you learn from some of the things. You learn from our mistakes, but at the same time, we can take some of those mistakes and we can take some of the decisions that we made and say, put that to the side. I don't have to dwell on that anymore, and it's done. So I was 34 when I had my first child, Danny. And when I got pregnant, I was already at the point of going, oh my gosh, I can't believe I waited till I was 34. I'm old, all this stuff's going to happen, and the statistics, and I'm always a worrier anyway, but I was worrying about it. And every time I go to the doctor, they say, oh, everything's fine, it's okay. And I'm like, no, he's not kicking, and I don't feel well, and this isn't right. And they're like, oh, everything's fine. Well, when he was born, everything was not fine. And right away from the beginning, he was breech, and I had to have a C-section. And right away, he had problems breathing, he had a little punctured lung, and they whisked him off to the NICU. And then they whisked me off the other direction to a room, and by the way, this was in a naval hospital, and nothing against, well, actually a lot against naval hospitals, but we'll get to that later. But they whisked me off to my own room, what I thought was going to be my own room, but it wasn't. It was a shared room with a mother who had had a healthy baby who was there in the room with her. So I'm having to deal with this, trying to figure out what's going on with my son. As my son is in the NICU, more and more things started to happen. He started to lose his reflexes. He stopped sucking. He had a little heart issue. Navy Hospital, they couldn't figure out what was wrong. So they're doing all kinds of tests. They did a genetics panel. They did x-rays, CAT scans, everything, and while I was there, they couldn't find anything, what was wrong. So they sent me home after 4 days without my son to an empty crib. And so the next day after I'd gotten home, I get a phone call from the hospital. And this naval hospital is actually about an hour away from my house, so it was quite a bit of a drive. And the doctor called and he said, "Hey, I need you to come in. I want to share the results of the CAT scan with you." And I'm like, I could just tell by the tone of the voice. I'm like, "Yeah, no, I think you need to tell me right now." He's like, "No, you need to come in." I'm like, "No, you need to tell me." And so he told me. And he said, the CAT scan shows that a third of his brain is missing. And where there should have been ridges, his brain is smooth. So I said, okay. And so I got with my husband, and we drove over to Portsmouth Hospital. I am naming the hospital, by the way. I don't care. Portsmouth Naval Hospital. And they showed us the CAT scan. And sure enough, the CAT scan showed that a third of his brain was missing, and there were no ridges where it should be. It was smooth. And so as we were there, we're talking about all the things. Now what are we going to do? And there was somebody who dealt with disabled individuals and infants, and they said, "Oh, hey, by the way, there's this home for disabled infants called St. Mary's Home for Disabled Infants. And by the way, there's one bed available." And so we said, you know what? Maybe that's what we need to do. We had a friend who had a child with a disability, and we saw how difficult it was for him or for the family and then for other children. And so we said, okay, we'll do this. So we put a do not resuscitate on Danny and went through all the paperwork to get him checked into Home for Disabled Infants. And right before we left the hospital, though, he's not quite 2 weeks old, I went up to the doctor and I said, "Listen, I want to get an MRI on this." And the doctor's like, "It doesn't matter, it's just going to say the same thing." And I said, "No, I want an MRI." And I basically wanted an MRI because I wanted to figure out what I did wrong, and then I wanted to figure out how to fix it. And so they did it. They did the MRI. The day that we took him home with a do not resuscitate on him, the following Monday we were going to be checking him in, or Tuesday, into to this Home for Disabled Infants. The day we did that, I called back and I said, "Hey, I'd like to know what the results of the MRI are." And the doctor said it basically shows the same thing. So we said, okay. So we took him to the Home for Disabled Infants, which is now overseen by a different hospital, Children's Hospital of the King's Daughter. Took him there, checked him in, because it was a check-in during the day, and then you had to leave, obviously. So we checked him in that first day. Came back the second day, and as we sat there, we're talking to the doctors about what are we going to do now and what all is involved. And I'm sitting there, and the nurse came in, and she puts a piece of paper in front of the doctor. And he looks at it, looks up at me, and he says, "We need to take this do not resuscitate off this child right now. There's nothing wrong with his brain." And the first thing I said was, "Are you sure that's Danny's MRI?" And they said, "We're positive that's Danny's MRI." I said, okay. So we took the do not resuscitate, turned around, and walked out of there going, what the hell just happened? Actually, I didn't say hell, I said something worse, but I won't say that here. But it was like, what just happened? And so we started going through, we had to make a decision. Now that we know it's not brain damage, do we take him home? What's next? And we realized that, this particular environment, this Home for Disabled Infants, was so well equipped with doctors and caregivers and everybody else that this was probably the best chance to find out what really was wrong, because there was something wrong. And so we kept him at the Home for Disabled Infants, and every morning I would wake up, I would have been up all night, skin crawling, just, the nightmares that nobody ever wants to deal with, and looking on the internet to find out what disorders there were, and come in and say, "Hey, will you check for this? Will you check for this? Will you check for that?" And they would do that. And then we went through that for about 6 weeks, and finally we brought him home, and he was home a week, and that's when we found out that he had Prader-Willi syndrome. Now the question is, wait a minute, there's nothing wrong with his brain. How did that happen? Well, it turns out that a hospital or HM, whatever they call him at the hospital, who had performed the CAT scan, had made a mistake. And when I called back to ask the doctor what the results were of the MRI, he either lied or he didn't even check the MRI. And so that kind of defining moment really changed my outlook and how I felt about a lot of things. And going back to thinking about, I can't even say hyperthymesia, that's a perfect example of why I would not want to have hyperthymesia, because I don't want to remember every painful detail. But at the same time, there are some things that came out of it that I think were very important, and I took those forward as I started my company. I thought about what's important, healthcare, and a lot of you have heard me say this, and people, and I have all these goofy sayings like, did anybody die? Because it's true. What's the worst, well, other than missing payroll, but what's the worst thing that could happen? No, did anybody die? So so that was what was so important. And when I started my company, it was right when all of this happened with my son. So I look back and think, well, this was a blessing, absolutely a blessing in disguise, that I had started as a consultant, starting my company, and I could be with my son during the day, focus on, because think back, brain damage, and then I find out he has Prader-Willi syndrome. I was like, I wasn't sure how I was going to fix brain damage, but I can fix Prader-Willi syndrome. Did a lot of research. I was able to really focus on that because I had my own business now, and I was trying to start a business. And it worked out great. I grew over the years, worked from home, had another child. Again, think about if I'd had that vivid memory, there is no way I would have had another child. I'm lucky I actually did have another one anyway, because think of all the genetic disorders. If anyone knew how many genetic disorders there are out there, none of us would procreate at all. But I was able to do that, and I grew the company. I moved here in 2004. I had 10 employees, 5 part-time, and the other 5 related to me. And then I grew that over the last several years. And then in 2012, I took a risk that professionally also says why I'm glad I don't have hyperthymesia, and why I think that compartmentalization, especially permanent compartmentalization, is an important thing. I took a risk. I took over a facility that NASA had, and equipment that they had to refurbish the shuttle. I got 2,000 pieces of equipment, a non-reimbursable Space Act agreement, no contract, no money, nothing, and then I had to take the next step to actually turn this into a successful entrepreneurial venture. So I leased a 160,000 square foot facility. I started hiring people. And keep in mind, I also have another company that I had been growing. It's more of a services side, engineering technology, and I'm trying to focus on this manufacturing facility. And I focused hard on it. I focused so hard on it, probably to the detriment of the other side of the business, but I did everything I could. Everybody worked as hard as they could to grow that thing. And we put a lot of money into it. We invested a significant amount of money, put a lot of heart and soul. But at the end of the day, as we got further and further along, it was 2, 3, 4 years, the NASA space program wasn't moving as fast. A couple of the other significant relationships that we worked on, people didn't win certain things they thought they were going to win, and time was not on my side. My company I basically started my company around 8 credit cards, all maxed to the hilt, SBA loans, double mortgages, that kind of thing. And that's how I've continued it. It's organic. So no investors, no acquisitions, nothing like that. So eventually you're going to run out of money, like if you do what I did in that manner. So I was running out of money. And I had to make that painful decision of, I've got to lay people off. Because either I'm going to take the whole thing down, or I'm going to have a heart attack, one of the two. And I decided it was time to let go. And so we stepped through layoffs. And it was awful. It was a year ago, last summer. It was the most horrible thing. And Tina's saying the same thing. I had never laid anybody off. And I had, up to that point, 450 employees. So in the whole history of my company, I never laid anybody off. I really took pride in that. We call it Hotel California. When you come work for Craig Technologies, you aren't leaving. But in this case, it was almost even more of a protection mode for the employees, because if I made the decision at that time, I could step down layoffs, and I could find people other jobs, and we did that. Some people we took from the manufacturing and put them on other contracts in other areas. Some we just waited until they found other jobs. Nobody was on the street. It worked well to step it down. It was stressful. I didn't eat. I didn't drink, so think how stressful. Those of you who know me. And then you're like, wow, something was wrong. I even, it was like the crying game. There were times when I'm like in the shower just going, I can't do this, and I'm like, I don't want to get out of bed. I'm going to bankrupt my whole family. What have I done? Well, we got through it. And it took time. We stepped through, and instead of completely getting rid of the entire manufacturing facility, I scaled it down. I started over. I kind of stepped back and went, okay, what can I learn from that? What do we do well? How can I take that and turn that into something successful? Big isn't always better. There's no question about that. Quality is better. And we had done so much and put so much investment in there, including millions of dollars, that it just seemed wrong to completely step away. So I didn't. And today, the manufacturing facility is doing great. It's thriving. We're getting ready to move out of that 160,000 square foot facility. We're not quite out of it yet, so I'm still drinking now, actually, because of that. But the good came out of it. And that goes back to thinking about that memory. There are times, I know that I can come up with those memories. Same thing with Danny. If somebody starts talking about the things, all of a sudden it becomes very, very clear. So it's obvious that I'm trying to repress it. But I think in a case like this, it's really important that I don't dwell on it. Because if I were dwelling on the memories from last summer, there is no way I would go forward again. I would never take another risk. I mean, there were so many things that occurred and happened, but instead, I put away the bad, and I think of all the good things that came out of it, and all the learning, and where we are today. Maybe not the vision where I wanted to be at the time, but it's still a good place. And so I think that's a good example, and then Danny is a good example of, you might have seen the title of my talk was, I have no recollection of those events, Madam Senator. Which I'll tell you where I got to tell you where that came from. I was trying to come up with a title. I didn't know what I was going to say, and my IT guy walked in and he goes, "Hey, how about this? That's pretty funny." And he was joking. I'm like, "That's awesome," because when you think about it, I mean, why do they say that? Some cases, I think, yeah, they're just trying to get out of, but now being in trouble or going to jail. But in other cases, we really don't have a recollection of those types of events, and I think that's okay. And that all fits in with what you guys have heard here today. We all make mistakes. We're not perfect. We need to learn from things. We can't dwell on the past, but instead move forward and go on to the next thing. So when people ask me, what's your favorite quote? I will usually say, sometimes you have to jump and build your wings on the way down, by Ray Bradbury. But I will say now, thanks to my IT guy, my favorite quote is, I have no recollection of those events, Madam Senator. Thank you very much.